Hey everyone, thanks so much for coming to my presentation today. My name is Alex Murata and I'm a second year PhD student with the Plays Research Group at Queen's University. And my presentation is called Girls and Women in Sport, a decade-long comprehensive review of the literature. And before we get started, I just want to thank everyone that's working on this project with me. Thanks so much for all your hard work, and thanks so much for being such a great team. It's been a real pleasure looking into this subject with you all. So thanks so much. All right, so just when taking stock of where we're at as far as working with girls and women in sport research in 2021, it's been reported that often girls and women find it difficult to locate ideal or appropriate sporting environments. It's also been found that there is often an overrepresentation of boys and men in sports science research compared to girls and women. And it's also been reported that there are far more authors of sports science papers that are men compared to women, which is also a problem, unfortunately. And so along with those findings, kind of the impetus behind this project was also sentences like these. So these were all taken from the discussion or the conclusion sections of published papers within sports psychology. And overall, all of these studies looked at sport within the context of boys and men, participants, athletes, and each study recommended that similar studies be conducted later with girls and women. And so these sentences come up fairly often. You see them fairly often, and so it was one of the reasons why we were inspired to complete the project that I'm talking about here today. And so our main research question was, what is the state of girls and women's research in sports psychology? So what's going on overall? And our second research question is what future research should be completed with girls and women within the sports psychology discipline. All right, so to complete this project, first we identified 5 sport and exercise psychology journals to explore. And we then downloaded every article published in those 5 journals that were published between January 2010 and December 2020. In total, that was 2,755 articles. And once we had those articles, we coded them to see if they were empirical or non-empirical. So did they publish results and findings or not? And then we took all of those empirical studies and we coded those for participant gender, research method, and the activity that they were investigating. And condensing things further, we took all of the studies that worked exclusively with girls and women and all the studies that worked exclusively with boys and men, and we set those aside and we coded them for additional information. So what we found was that 74% of all of the empirical articles used a mixed gendered samples. And 16% used exclusively boys and men. And 10% used exclusively girls and women. It was found that the research methods used were fairly uniform throughout, although it's interesting to note that the most common article within the articles that we set aside to code were would be a paper that used quantitative methods and an all boys or all men sample. So when looking at the articles that use boys and men, the most common context, so 68% percent of those articles looked at team sports. And it's interesting to note that only 3% looked at the results of putting boys or men into some sort of exercise or a health program or intervention. And that's because of all the studies that looked at girls and women. A much greater proportion rather, explored outcomes associated with some sort of health or exercise intervention. And the balance between looking at team sports and individual sports was more of a balance compared to the studies with boys and men. And looking further into the sports that appeared within these articles, you can see that boys and men's soccer was by far the most common context that was explored, followed by rugby, basketball, and golf. And when looking at the studies with girls and women, while there are far fewer, it appears as though soccer was also the most common context looked at, followed by basketball and also swimming, which is interesting because there were very few studies that looked at boys and men participating in swimming. And finally, if we take a look at the amount of studies produced per year over that 11-year period, we can see that it was in only 1 year, 2017, where there were more studies that worked with girls and women. And every other year, we can see that it was far more common for studies to work with boys and men. Right, so as far as the next steps go for this project, we're going to conduct a more detailed breakdown journal by journal. And we're also going to take a look at the findings of each study and see what was reported there. And after looking at everything, we suggest that researchers be more purposeful about recruiting girls and women for their research. We think it's important to explore a greater variety of sporting contexts. And overall, it would be great if a greater diversity of athletes were engaged in the research process. Awesome. Well, thanks so much for listening, and I look forward to fielding any questions that you might have. Awesome. Thank you.